Hi, everyone, and welcome. We will get started in just a few moments.
All right. Pretty good. Pretty good. It's coming up.
For those of you who just joined, we'll get started in just a moment. All right, we'll get started. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our webinar, Detect and Respond Recommendations from the 2024 Cyber Risk Landscape Report. My name is Victoria, and I will be hosting your webinar today. But before we begin, there are a couple housekeeping items I would like to go over. This session is being recorded. Post-event, you will receive the presentation. We will be launching a poll question at the end of the webinar. So please be on the lookout for that and only click your response once. Otherwise, it'll cancel it out. You are all automatically muted. If you'd like to ask a question live, please raise your hand and we can bring you up on stage. And feel free to engage with the speaker by using the chat function, the Q&A, or the message area. It's now time for the good stuff. Tim, I'm going to pass it right over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Victoria. I appreciate that. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar today. So let's just kick this off. Let's go to the next slide here, if this thing actually works. Right. So who am I? Not that you guys care, but just a real quick background on the speaker today. So I've been in cybersecurity for about 20 years now. I started off as the director of cybersecurity at DuPont, a chemical manufacturing company, famous for inventing things like Tyvek and Kevlar for bulletproof vests. So I was responsible for protecting the trade secrets, right? 200 plus years of trade secret information within that organization. And that's really where I kind of fell in love with cybersecurity and digital forensics and IR and threat intelligence. And then after that, I joined Digital Guardian, which is the data loss prevention company. I was their CISO and VP of Managed Security Services. We focused on managed security service delivery for MDR, EDR, and also DLP. And then also I worked at Exidium, formerly known as Komodo, as the CISO and EVP of SOC Services. Same thing, focused on MDR and XDR. So really my career has kind of spanned really with a focus on managed detection and response, catching the bad guy, catching the bad girl, whatever. And now I am the field CISO here at Critical Start. So I'm excited. I just joined here about 2 months ago. So from an agenda perspective, these are a couple of the things I wanted to discuss today. Really kind of the state of cyber risk in business today. What does that look like from a landscape perspective? I want to talk a little bit about the role of MDR as well and how that plays into cyber risk management. Also enhancing MDR with more proactive cybersecurity elements. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means. Then go into practical steps to strengthen those defenses and then kind of wrap it up with some conclusions towards the end. But if you have any questions at all, during the presentation, please feel free to ping them in the message box, and I will address them as we go on. So before we kick this off, marketing department spend a pretty significant amount of time on putting together this awesome report on the cyber risk landscape peer report. We essentially interviewed like 1 million CISOs. It probably wasn't 1 million. I think it was actually 1,000. But we sent out surveys and we asked 1,000 CISOs on what do their controls look like today? What do they fear today? What keeps them up at night? And with that, we were able to compile this beautiful looking report. Feel free to download that. I think we're going to ping that in the chat window if you want to download it directly from there. But it's a fantastic report. And I'm going to go over some of the highlights in that report during today's webinars and then kind of branch out as well, from there. So let's start off with the big scary number, right? 83% of cybersecurity professionals reported in that cybersecurity landscape report that they experienced a cyber breach, right, requiring attention despite having traditional threat-based detection and response controls. So what does that mean? So, organizations who have MDR are still being breached. Does that mean that MDR is failing? Does that mean that MDR is not good enough? Not necessarily. I think it always kind of comes down to, what is the entrance vector of the attack? Did you have the proper upfront controls in place to prevent that breach? MDR really is kind of the last line of defense, and you're really relying upon a lot in order to kind of detect breach activity, especially if they're low and slow and they're moving, sporadically throughout the environment, kind of in a lateral movement type behavior and staying under the radar. So breaches still happen even with MDR being deployed. This is why we really need to think about how we do, proactive breach prevention while layering in, cybersecurity controls and how we harden those defenses. And of course, yes, you see the puppies of hackers. This is how I like to envision adversaries. It's a bunch of hackers, wearing little doggy sweaters, kind of in a control room. It kind of makes my day a little bit more fun. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the evolution of threat detection and response. Just real quick, give you a little history lesson. Really in the 1990s, and I know someone on this call is going to argue with me and say that's not when it happened, Tim. But really, this was kind of the initial offerings of firewalls and intrusion detection systems and network intrusion systems and even antivirus. Yes, there was antivirus dating back to even the 1970s. I think in 1972, Ray Tomlinson came out with something called Reaper, which was a program designed to delete the creeper virus. I know they rhyme, which is kind of weird. And then I remember even in 1987 they come out with something called the Ultimate Virus Killer, the UVK, and that was founded by G Data Software. But really in the 90s is when they started to develop antivirus software that focused on multiple threats, right? Not just single threat, type variants. And then after the 90s, we kind of got into the 2000s when we're focused on intrusion prevention. So not only are we detecting, let's prevent, up front. Let's also provide host intrusion prevention capabilities on top of those hosts. And then also security information and event management systems. SIMs is when this really started to gain traction in the early 2000s. Let's centralize the logs, right? So we have visibility across our network, our firewall devices, our server devices, our Active Directory type activity. And this was critical, right? I think when SIMs came out, CISOs bought SIMs. They poured a bunch of logs into the SIMs, but I don't think they really knew exactly how to operationalize that. You really need people and process behind a SIM technology in order to make that thing sing. So really the 2000s, although these technologies were coming out, how to best leverage and utilize them, it took a little bit of time. And then in 2010 era, around that time frame, you start to see endpoint detection response capabilities, next gen firewalls, network packet capture and reconstruction capabilities. Those tools were pretty awesome, if I do say more so myself. I think network forensics is an exciting space. I don't know if you remember NetWitness back in the day, and then they became, I think, security analytics when they went to RSA, and now they're back to NetWitness. So they had a bit of a ride. But if you had an extra like $1 million and you wanted to deploy a pretty cool software, this thing did full packet capture, and you could deconstruct the packets on the fly. And that was an awesome technology, kind of having visibility into what's going in and out, your network gateway. And then around the 2015 timeframe, you really start to see this emergence of managed detection response, kind of that terminology. Now I know CrowdStrikes and others were starting to offer this a little bit earlier than that. The Red Canaries, even Critical Start, we came out around that time frame for offering and delivering MDR services. But this is really where it started to pick up, and it's kind of once again taking a technology like an EDR tool, an endpoint protection platform, type utility, and operationalizing it, right? Putting the people and process behind that technology in order to kind of get your most bang for your buck, your return on investment, being able to detect those things that, maybe the technology is seeing, but you really needed the human analyst in order to respond, right? And kind of drill into that a little bit further. And then 2020, of course, COVID hits, which kind of slowed everything down. But then you start to see, this terminology of extended detection and response, XDR. Let's gain visibility across our endpoint, our network, our cloud. Let's all centralize it to a location where we can start conducting threat hunting exercises and kind of do that on a day-to-day basis. So really XDR, took off from there. And these are the terms, right? These are the terms in the industry, and this is where we are. And where we go into the 2025s and 2030s, it's obviously still to be seen. We're going to see a lot of AI, augmentation as well, but it's exciting. We're living in exciting times today. So let's talk a little bit about, kind of some of the numbers we started to see in this report. I'm going to kind of pivot back and forth, out of the report, in the report, and give some insights there. But, we start to see some large numbers here in terms of average cost of a data breach. And we did see, pretty, fairly significant increase in the cost of a data breach from last year to this year in 2024. It's a 15% increase in large enterprise, and then, a 13% increase in small orgs. Now, could you say inflation? Maybe. Could you say maybe there's an uptick in breaches just in general? Sure. But beyond financial losses, organizations are also experiencing incidents that severely damage trust, right, corporate reputation. I've been a part of businesses and organizations where if a trade secret is stolen, right, from your organization, and you've invested billions in research and develop on that particular trade secret, and that adversary has that and doesn't have to invest billions, they can then undercut you in the market. And we've seen that play out, and we've had to actually sell off strategic business units when you have breaches like that, right, of that magnitude. So multi-billion dollar type industries kind of having to spin that off because they're able to undercut you based on them stealing that information. So that's the real Connect effect. That's the real world effect of losing trade secret information, right, from a breach. We can also look to 2024's Verizon Data Breach Report. I love this report. They come out with it every year. They always give some interesting trends, like what's the primary entrance vector for attack, and typically it is credentials and phishing and exploiting vulnerabilities. But what I did think it was interesting in this year's report is vulnerability exploitation is up 180%, which is kind of mind blowing if you ask me. And yes, you could probably attribute a lot of that to the MOVEit transfer vulnerability that was pretty famous last year, right? Which was exploited by the Clop ransomware group. That's Clop with a zero, of course, and some other several high profile companies being attacked via that. But that was a significant vulnerability, and these are the types of things, right, that we have to combat. Right, these are the types of things that we need to be prepared for. Having an effective vulnerability management program in place in order to kind of prevent these types of threats from occurring. Altogether, right? Now, of course, MDR plays a significant role in preventing, the success of a breach, right? A breach can still happen, a vulnerability can still be exploited, and MDR is there to obviously detect those additional, life cycles within that attack life cycle, right? The action, not objectives, the moving laterally, the increase of privileges within the environment. So these are the types of things, once again, we have to focus on kind of hardening. And then also 92% ransomware is the top threat across industries. We saw that, this was input from, from that Verizon Data Breach report, that ransomware is still on the rise, right? It's not going anywhere. I think in the early phases of ransomware was let's try and deploy this ransomware and get some money. Now it's let's steal some data, let's extort them, let's make sure that they pay the money, right? They're establishing footholds in these organizations. They're making sure that organizations pay up, and not relying upon, hopefully they don't have a restore and recovery procedures in place, right? They want to make sure that they actually get get paid, right, for that infiltration. So we do see obviously this uptick as well in ransomware across all different verticals and industries. So what do we do, right? MDR is always and has been kind of considered the foundation of modern defense, as the last line of defense, right? Threat detection response mechanisms, they're critical, right? They're crucial in mitigating cyber threat activity before they escalate into a significant breach. Breaches can still occur. Once again, as I mentioned on the last slide, these things can still happen, but how do we measure success? Can we, minimize that initial infection detection, that time to detection, the TTD metric, right? And how do we restore and actually isolate and kick that, particular threat out from the organization? That's the ultimate goal, right? I mean, you want to be able to stop the breach from occurring, obviously in the first place, but you also, down the line want to prevent any sort of data exfiltration or, once again, that actions on objectives that threat actors typically try to go for. So what do we see as the challenges? We do, and this is pretty common, right? We see this increasing pressure from internal SOC teams, and these are all the common themes, right, that we typically see: having under-resourced security teams, increasingly complex environments with fragmented security tools. That can become very difficult. When CISOs or cybersecurity directors, when they're deploying all this different security technology, and they don't necessarily have kind of a cohesive vision on how all of those technologies are going to work together, it can be fairly complex. It can also be complex in the kind of in the way that the infrastructure is laid out, right? What sort of operating systems you have within your environment. Do you have Mac and Windows and Linux, and what types of service, right? These are the types of things that need to be taken into consideration, right, when you are deploying security technologies, so you have appropriate coverage for all those different areas. There's been a wide ranging of evolving threats too, right? As threats evolve, we also need to evolve too on the defense side of the house. There's this inability to prove effectiveness of security programs because they're not properly documenting the maturity of their program. I think that's really important as well internally. If you're a CISO or someone who's in charge of cybersecurity, is making sure you kind of measure where you're at along that chain. Misconfigured products, lack of 24/7 coverage. We see this all the time. And we also see this where traditional MDR can fall short as well. Maybe you subscribe to an MDR provider, and there's certain things that come up with them. And not all MDR providers are created equal. I think that's important to know. Full disclosure: when I was interviewing for various MDR companies, one of the things that came up was alert fatigue. They always talked about, well, Tim, how can we kind of go about doing log reduction? How do you get to a point where you can manage all those inbound alerts? I mean, these are the questions they're asking me during an interview, and that's pretty scary. These are MDR providers. Like, you'd think by now they'd have that thing solved, but they didn't. And that's ultimately actually one of the reasons why I joined Critical Start, because that was something that they, in my opinion, have like ultimately solved. It's actually pretty impressive, kind of being able to have this trusted behavior registry of whitelisted activity based on kind of the laws of an operating system, and knowing what to whitelist based on business context. And we can talk about that later. But alert fatigue is still an issue. Lack of a comprehensive approach to cyber risk reduction, that's a real issue, right? We don't really see MDR providers necessarily helping to reduce risk from other areas in the organization. It's more of just, hey, I'll give you some eyes on glass, we'll give you some incident response. It's not enough. It's really not. So you really got to think about, what other layers of control can we help organizations kind of combat these threats? That with that comes lack of confidence in also vendor response actions. You want to make sure that MDR providers have the response capabilities necessary to isolate, contain, revoke certificates, reset passwords. If you don't have those APIs in place, between a vendor's platform and the security technologies deployed, I mean, what's the point? You don't want to just have managed detection. You really want to have managed protection or a response element as well. That can work with you. That can be an extension of your security team. That can, take action on the part in the middle of the night, or on Christmas morning, or on July 4th. Kind of those times where you're not necessarily at the computer, right? And that's really why you want to sign up for those 24/7, 365 days a year, integrated, type services. Same thing with contractual service level agreements. You want to make sure that you have those SLAs in place too with your MDR providers. Like, what are the SLAs if a security event happens? Like, how long does it take you to triage alerts? These are the types of questions you should ask when you are looking at various MDR providers. So this is kind of where, look, this is not a vendor focused, type webinar, but I do want to talk about a couple of things that Critical Start does, because I'm very proud of that. Once again, it's, one of the primary reasons why I joined this organization. They've got some really cool technology, right? They offer that transparency to our customers, right? Everything that we see, you see, we see, kind of, a revolving door, right? Of the log activity that's occurring right within your platform. So, and that's great. I think the transparency is critical. We also offer 60-minute contractual SLAs, and this is programmatically built into the platform. So you can literally see how long it took Sammy in the SOC to, triage an alert, on day 1 or day 2 or day 5. It's unbelievable, right? Every single metric is recorded and tracked. And the second we step over that 60-minute mark, you get credits, you get service credits. And I think that's important. I think it's important to hold MDR providers accountable for the things they say, because you'll see that a lot of times is, oh yeah, we have an SLA. Well, how do they measure it? Right. And these are the types of things you might want to ask. We also got something called Mobile SOC. It's pretty cool. It's actually an iPhone application, Android application. You can download it, and it's not like a website overlay. It's got buttons like it's an actual installed application. So if you need to reset a password, you can click a button in that app, and it does it, right? And so I think that kind of having those differentiators is important, from an MDR service perspective. Also increased detection effectiveness. You want to make sure that, they have detection mechanisms across that entire MITRE ATT&CK framework. When I say the entire, please, let's not, I mean, it is impossible to cover every single element, right? And sub technique across MITRE ATT&CK. The individuals over at MITRE have done a fantastic job of mapping every single thing that could possibly go wrong, right, in your environment. But you want to make sure that an MDR provider has great coverage, not good coverage, great coverage, right, across all those different vectors, because ultimately that's what stops a breach, right, from progressing forward onto to being a successful breach. And same things with, kind of managing risk. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second, but also reducing risk exposure. I think that's important, right? Decreasing time to value, right? Security tool configuration, health checks, making sure everything is working properly, right, within your organization. All right, let's shift a little bit to also some stats in this cyber, risk landscape report. So one of the questions that we asked is currently unknown organizational cyber risk a top concern? We see last year 68%. Yes, cyber risk is a concern. Yet this year 85%. So pretty significant increase. 85%. That's pretty. It's pretty big, right? 15% of the people said no, cyber risk is not a really concern, or 14 point whatever 4% doesn't find that as a concern. It is a concern, I think, right? Lack of expertise is typically one of the greatest challenges that kind of contributes to that, right? I don't have a SOC team, or I don't have, an organization that can focus on these 10 different things. I got one person to do all that. And that's difficult, right? I think it's hard to protect an environment, especially when you have lack of budget as well for that, right? There's that kind of that lack of budget in order to kind of build out your organization to protect. And then we got a bunch more numbers and stats, right? 66% of businesses reported limited visibility and insight into their cyber risk profiles. So, where is my risk across, my organization? That's hard to measure unless you have kind of maybe the appropriate process and tools in place in order to do that. 99% of organizations plan to offload specific segments of cyber risk reduction and work streams. So there was 1%. There was one person apparently that's not doing that, but that's a big number. 99%. That's actually insane. 81% of organizations are now planning to prioritize proactive risk reduction strategies, and that's what I'm going to talk about next in a second here around what that means. How do we be more proactive in protecting our environment? Because you don't want to rely 100% on the MDR function. The MDR is fantastic; it's great. There's going to be things that slip through the gaps. How do we prevent those things from slipping through the gaps? And that's really what we want to focus on next. Right before I get to that, though, one other question we had was, what, if anything, prevents you from conducting more frequent cybersecurity risk assessments? I think it's important to ask that question. Why can't you conduct security risk assessment evaluations? And typically you see same type of responses: time constraints, budget, complexity, shortages of staff. Those last two have come down from 2024. So apparently a shortage of staff is not as big of a deal, or complexity. I might argue that particular point, but it seems to be not as big of a deal as last year. Maybe they got some funding, right, over the last couple of years, which is great. But conducting those evaluations is absolutely critical. Like, you need to be able to assess your whole organization, and that kind of brings us to, I I call this I call this Jesus wheel, right? Jesus, take the wheel. This is the risk wheel. And this is not a religious talk, but I love this wheel. It is a wheel around, the framework of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And those are those five critical areas. From an identification perspective, do you have asset visibility in your environment? Are you augmenting that information into your CMDB? How are you tracking what assets you even have? Where your trade secrets or your high risk information even reside? You have an effective asset management solution or tool or process in place in order to do that. If you don't know what to protect, how are you even going to protect it? You can't just, I used to have a CTO that would call this, he would say, you can't just peanut butter and jelly your controls. You need to make sure that you do have a focus on where you're putting your dollars and your investments and what you want to protect. So I think the identification part is absolutely critical. Obviously, the protection element, right? What are you doing from a vulnerability perspective? How are you making sure your MITRE ATT&CK, mitigations are all rolled out? Do you have SIM capabilities where you're centralizing all of your log sources? Is that being operationalized and used to the best of its ability? Do you have detailed alerts in place to look at multi-event correlations? These are things that you kind of have to ask yourself, as you look at the technology you have deployed. And then coverage gaps. Do you have any coverage gaps? Which is also really important. And then detect and respond. Obviously, that's the MDR side of the house. Manage XDR, manage SIM. Incident response, which I love. That's my favorite topic of all time. You got to have these things in place as well. From an IR perspective, are you prepared? Do you have an incident response plan in place? Do you have a retainer in place, maybe with a third-party organization who is readily available to come in and provide you deep level forensics, the ability to respond immediately and kind of give you that root cause analysis and isolate devices and give you all the affected devices and all affected accounts? These are critical questions that you need to ask, and they need to be answered very quickly a lot of times, right? Because every single moment that you have, a threat or threat actor in your environment, they're taking actions within your environment, and that's not good, right? And then on the recovery side, of course, you're doing compromise assessments, post-incident monitoring, advisory consulting type services, all very critical. So let's, one other question that was asked, and this is an incredibly long question, by the way. How would you rate your organization's evidence-based visibility into its cyber risk landscape for asset identification and protection risk? Wow, whoever came up with that, it's a great question, but it's pretty big. They said full visibility, right? That's a problem. Having full visibility, in your environment, and I see this time and time again. I've worked, I would say, thousands of incident response cases. Um, I don't want to say a majority. I would say like 70% of the cases had to do with an unprotected asset. It was an entrance vector that was not protected with the security technology that we had deployed. And we'll see some of that in these stats here too. 28% of total network breaches were due to unmonitored, unmanaged devices, meaning the devices, weren't even being evaluated. Maybe data wasn't coming off of them. We weren't, consuming any event logs from those devices. Maybe it lacked, endpoint protection. So, 75% of these came from a lack of endpoint protection. That's pretty high, right? So if you don't have, let's say you have Sentinel-1 or CrowdStrike deployed throughout your environment, and yet you're missing it on, a good portion or several of your devices, that's an entrance vector, right, for an adversary. So it's very critical to make sure that you have total endpoint protection across your environment. And that's what we call endpoint coverage gaps. MDR effectiveness is only effective as long as it gets the right threat signals, it's receiving. So if you have limited visibility in your environment, needs to be addressed and taken care of. So it's important to identify those rogue assets, those assets that aren't necessarily being monitored. Um, on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about asset visibility. So what are we doing to kind of solve that from an MDR perspective on critical start side of the house, right? So you need to have the ability to verify security tools are deployed properly, right? Prioritize endpoint coverage gaps by critical assets for the greatest risk reduction, right? So once again, knowing where your assets reside, your most critical assets, and then reducing the risk based on the criticality of those risks. Monitoring asset inventory changes over time, discovering stale or orphan security agents, not checking in for updates. You kind of want to make sure everything's up to date, because if you don't, once again, you have a gap. And what we've done is we've come out with this beautiful dashboard of endpoint visibility that gives you that asset visibility, right? So we can consume logs from all these different data sources, right? Your endpoint protection platforms like CrowdStrike or whatever, Tenable.io, right? We can consume information from Qualys, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, even what is it? Microsoft Entra ID, Active Directory. We consume all that data. We dedupe the information and then identify a unique list of hosts that are missing endpoint protection. That's like pretty good information to have. And this comes with our MDR service. So as soon as you turn on, right, you have this endpoint coverage gap capability and service where we're identifying any of those assets that lack that protection. So once again, we give you that proper MDR effectiveness, through our service. So here's just a quick story. I love this story. I worked this story. We saw a brute force password, basically a password attempt against this externally facing RDP server. So a remote desktop server. It was sitting out there. It got stood up by an IT individual, but it did not have the proper protection. Didn't have endpoint protection installed, and it wasn't leveraging 2FA, right? Like multi-factor authentication. As soon as they brute force into that, literally the domain admin username and password were the same. Like, why would you do that? So the password was actually the same as username. They were able to get in a matter of seconds. So the scanner just went to town. 2 seconds, it's in. As soon as they got in, they mapped the network with their own internal scanner, and they start accessing file servers and information. On day two, so this was day one. On day two, they come back because they've established persistence. They come back in, they started wiping event logs. They don't want to be tracked, right? They don't want forensic analysis to determine what happened. Then they create their new admin accounts, once again, for persistence purposes. And then they start moving laterally to the VM cluster. They access the VMware environment. They access the domain controller. They start dumping credentials on the domain controller. So that means all credentials for the environment were essentially dumped. And then they start accessing a file server, backup server, SQL database, all that information they wanted to get. And sure enough, what did they do with that information? They packaged it all up and they sent it to sendspace.com. So basically, they exfiltrated data to their Death Star, and now they have all your information. This was a case where, once again, they didn't have proper visibility to that RDP server. Now, I didn't tell you some things about this story. As soon as the dumping of credentials occurred, this was actually an MDR customer for me at a prior company. We immediately saw this. We were able to, start isolating devices. But at that point, they were moving laterally through. It only took them a matter of minutes to then start exfiltrating the data. It was too late. Like there was nothing you could do. What they were trying to do, though, they were going to come back on day 3 to deploy ransomware. This was a ransomware event because what they were exfiltrating out of this environment was disaster recovery information. They were basically learning the environment. So this wasn't the full story. It was a success story from at least preventing them from coming back in. We were able to kind of clean that up. But had we not seen, that dumping of credentials on the domain controller, this might have been missed, right? Because they were leveraging accounts that have been created, like legitimate domain admin accounts, and that's very tough to see right within your MDR logs. How often, if ever, do you conduct full comprehensive cybersecurity assessments of risk? I've been a CISO before. I've been a CISO for 10 years or so. Conducting these cybersecurity risk evaluations are imperative. Like you need to know where you stand, basically at all times. And if we look at kind of how often they do that, some people said never. That was last year. No one said never this year, which is great. That's actually that's fantastic to see because that's scary when we have people who are like, no, I don't do risk assessments. I don't care. That's scary. They probably should not be in a CISO level role. But we're seeing a lot more uptick in how often they're doing it. Like a majority of them are saying every 6 to 11 months, and that's great, right? If you can do it twice a year, fantastic. If you do it once a year, great. That's great as well. But how do we combat that? So from a risk assessment perspective, consolidating cyber risk assessments, by third parties and having the ability to do self-assessments in a portal, in a centralized portal, that's awesome, right? To be able to have that sort of capability. We can also assess security risk levels with industry peer benchmarking. So do you want to know how your peers are doing in the industry, or you want to like fall behind and kind of be the outlier? You don't want to fall behind, right? You want to keep up with pace, or you want to be better, right? Kind of beyond the maturity levels of the other organizations in your peer network, right? You want to be able to continuously track and measure and visualize security risk. Identify risk reduction, keep, priorities, right? Allocate cybersecurity resources to the maximum benefits. So we have these capabilities that are built into our platform. It's what we call our core platform. And this really helps, once again, kind of streamline all these capabilities into one central location where you have MDR, risk assessments, asset visibility, and you can do all this crazy stuff with it, right? You can go through NIST, for example. I know there's a couple there I just showed you, like ISO 27001, SOC 2, right? NIST 1.1, NIST CSF 2.0. You can walk through those assessments, right? And then you can document your maturity level. Like I'm not compliant, or I am partially compliant, or fully. Maybe I'm fully. I can add comments. I can upload attachments. I can basically document, my full level of risk, right, across all those controls. For that particular one, there's 153 controls, right, on this one. But what's awesome about this is once you've done all that, everything is now documented. You can actually click the download button or spit out a report for those auditors who always come by looking and asking you questions. And then you can provide them that evidence because all the evidence can be, included within those uploads, which is amazing. You can also get to prioritize risk action improvements. Like these are the actions you need to take to improve, your organization from a risk perspective. You can look at your risk profile, like show me all the areas and where, I need improvement, right? And we're talking about, risk assessments, supply chain risk, awareness training. You can basically evaluate yourself in all those different functions and then also benchmark yourself against peers, which is great, right? So if you're in the software industry, in this particular case, I can see, okay, in the software industry, this is how I benchmark against, other entities within that space. Okay, vulnerability management. We're going to be wrapping up here soon. Vulnerability management is just as critical. I think is, if not one of the most critical, is how do you patch your vulnerabilities? How do you plug those holes? Having the ability to identify your vulnerabilities, evaluate and prioritize it, report those vulnerabilities, and then remediate it. It's not enough to just get kind of a spit out of all the vulnerabilities in your environment, right? Let's say you have 5,000 devices. You're going to get a report of 60,000 vulnerabilities that you need to take, and they're all high risk. That's not enough. And I'll tell you what we're doing to kind of combat that complexity, right? So, having rich asset-aware, threat-informed vulnerability detection reports, having risk-ranked recommendations and patch catalogs, kind of having this turnkey program in place, a full vulnerability management service where you can get those answers, very quickly. That's what we're looking to deliver here, right? And I kind of look at it as 3 different phases, right? So, you start off at the tool phase. This is what you do, right? You buy this shiny tool that that does all this vulnerability scanning. It's fantastic, but you haven't operationalized it. It's just a tool. It's just telling you what your vulnerabilities are, right? Then you want to wrap process and 24/7 ops behind that. That's that vulnerability management function. So if you don't have resources in house that can do that, you really need to outsource that because that's a critical function. And then finally, if not, even more critical, right, is how do you focus on what vulnerabilities you want to, prioritize and fix? You're not gonna be able to address 60,000 of them. Maybe there's only like 10, 15, or maybe there's, let's not 10, 15, maybe there's like 300, right, vulnerabilities in your environment that you really need to address out of that 60,000. That's what vulnerability prioritization is. And we can look at that from this little triangle mappy thing here, right? So it kind of starts out with here's where you are from a CVSS score perspective, and that's the scores we're all used to seeing, right? But if we start moving up the chain, right, show me weaponized vulnerability, show me actively exploited. What is the criticality of the assets that has this vulnerability? If you enrich that vulnerability information, all in that program, then you can seriously focus on your most critical assets and the vulnerabilities that really need to be addressed from a patching perspective. And then we've got this beautiful dashboard that shows all of this, right? So here's that big number I was talking about. Hey, you have 57,000 total open vulnerabilities. That's pretty scary, right? When you see a big number like that, and then you can kind of take it down to the medium level ones or ones that are reopened or then the fixed ones, right? So that's how we've kind of prioritized it, right? So red is total open vulnerabilities, reopen, and then fixed. But what you see to the right here is a prioritization, right? Assets with CVEs that are used by exploits, assets with weaponized CVEs. So if we're seeing from a threat intelligence perspective that vulnerabilities are being actively exploited by the bad people, let's raise the risk level. Let's raise that score. If we're seeing CVEs used by botnets, let's raise the score. Ransomware, raise the score, right? And then we can kind of prioritize where we need to address those particular gaps. And you can drill down into these reports and see fundamentally, right, exactly which patches need to be applied, which devices need those patches, and then the actual risk score with all that enrichment together. And that's awesome, right? I think that is such a beautiful slide. Like to be able to kind of drill down into that. I think that's really important. And then once again, you'll see here on this criticality distribution. I want to drive it back to asset management and understanding the criticality level of your devices. Tier 0 is your most critical. Like those are the things you need to protect. Tier 1, very, very important as well. Tier 2, so you can kind of once again address those vulnerabilities in that layered approach, like focusing on, maybe you want to just focus on tier 0 first. Let's get those 57 assets immediately patched. Or maybe let's focus on externally facing devices. Well, maybe that's your tier 1 devices, because they are vulnerable, right, to being exploited. Maybe you have a web application running on that. So those are the things that you want to address first. It's all about prioritization, from a vulnerability perspective. So what's the architecture slide for critical start? So what does it actually look like? So in the customer environment, you're going to see, identify and protect. Those are those areas that we want to focus on. That's the asset and vulnerability functions, right? Posture ingestion, looking for misconfigurations, looking at vulnerability prioritization, doing peer benchmarking, understanding from a risk perspective, what needs to be addressed. Once again, if MDR providers aren't, kind of taking it up to that layer and they're just providing kind of that single threaded, use case of we just do managed detection and response, I don't know. I don't know if it's enough, right? I think adding additional layers of capabilities and control, right, to help you mature your organization internally. That's that's the promised land. I think that's where that's the North Star. That's where you need to go. Is really reducing your level of risk within your organization. And we have spent the last year and a half on building all of these capabilities into our platform. They're readily available today, and they are awesome. And customers are starting to get all the true benefits right out of those different capabilities. So as we wrap up our presentation, all right, I'm right on time. I wanted to be around 40 minutes, 45 minutes, because I know these presentation webinars sometimes can feel a little long. What are the conclusion and key takeaways? You like that little keyhole? That was pretty clever. What are the key takeaways? So combining MDR with proactive cybersecurity elements such as risk assessments, asset visibility, vulnerability management, and endpoint security significantly enhances an organization's defense capabilities. Is anyone going to argue with me on that one? I mean, that I know that sounds like that's common sense, but typically you don't see those two elements together. You don't see MDR paired with proactive risk assessments and doing all these additional capabilities. It's just not really readily available in the market today. Well, we're taking a little bit of a different approach here at Critical Start. Beyond financial losses, breaches severely damage company reputation, right, and erode customer trust and result in regulatory penalties and so on. So as I talk through some of those examples, earlier within the presentation, yeah, there's real world effects to this. If you have a breach to your environment, I think we all, can see what happens, right, to that particular organization. It's not just financial loss. There's a lot of things that need to be considered. So it's important to make sure that you're addressing, once again, all those upfront controls so that you prevent a breach from occurring in the first place. MDR services are essential in modern cybersecurity strategies. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. MDR does provide the ability to identify those garden variety type malware threats, those advanced persistent threats, right? If you're an organization that's in that state-sponsored espionage, crosshairs, right? You need MDR, like you need a SOC, you need 24/7, monitoring and really the ability to centralize all your logs into a location where you can monitor for that activity, because they're not going away. They're only going to get better. So it's important to make sure that you address that. I love this one. Human expertise remains indispensable in cybersecurity. I don't care what anyone says. There's a lot of talk, right, about AI replacing, the SOC analyst. I don't think it's ever going to replace a SOC analyst. I mean, is it going to augment the SOC analysts and make their jobs easier, faster, more efficient? Yeah, probably. Yeah, maybe it might replace a couple of jobs. But I do think AI is going to have its, place in making, SOC analysts more efficient. When it comes to triaging alerts that come in, it's not always best to be the fastest. You want to be fast, but you also want to be right? You don't want to cause a false positive where there is a breach and you missed it. So I think, kind of pairing the human element also with, AI can help, remove that, right? It gives you the ability to kind of triage things quickly, and then focus on maybe those things that could be potential false positives or not false positives, and then investigate that further. I always think there's going to be a human element without a doubt. You really need to have that eyes on glass human expertise as well. Clearly I didn't build out this slide correctly with the numbers, but here come all the numbers: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then finally, cybersecurity is not a one-time effort, but it's a continuous process. Right? It's something that involves, conducting proactive risk assessments, doing vulnerability management and prioritization, doing comprehensive asset inventories, making sure that you have EDR and SIM coverage gap analysis, as a part of that, and also asset criticality ratings. If you're not prioritizing your assets and marking them with criticality, like, what are you doing? Right? You need to. Even if you have an Excel spreadsheet, you should at least start somewhere. I've seen a ton of Excel spreadsheets, where organizations, focus on that first. Maybe they don't have the budget to do that. Maybe they don't have funds to, go with a platform, type service, even like Critical Start. But let's work towards that. Let's, on a maturity level, let's at some point maybe we make the investment to go with an MDR provider that provides all that. But you need to start somewhere, and that's really kind of the takeaway. At least my biggest takeaway, right, from creating even this deck is, you got to start somewhere, and you got to make sure that you're documented and you're moving towards, kind of that higher level of maturity. All right. That ends it for my presentation today. If you want to become friends with me, you can. You can reach out to me, tim.banders@criticalstart.com. That's my email. I don't know why I gave my phone number, but hey, if you want to shoot me a text, feel free. And I'm also on LinkedIn as well. If you want to reach out, feel free to LinkedIn me. I'm actually a pretty nice guy. Do we have any questions, Victoria, on the line?
Yes, we actually do. So with alerts and tickets, are the recommendations canned responses based off the type of alert, or are they recommendations or observations that are real-time responses from an analyst who actually assessed the alert details?
Hernandez, that is a fantastic question. That kind of speaks to the human element of this. No, we don't have any canned responses. Now, within our SOC team, we do have the ability to provide recommendations on things that we want to say from a playbook perspective, but everything is eyes on glass. They're making sure that they're detailing out everything, from a risk perspective, from a business perspective. They're enriching that alert with information pertaining also to the environment that we're protecting. So no canned responses necessarily, but we provide all that context for you in the alert, and then we take action on your behalf, dependent on the terms of engagement, right? Like what are we allowed to do? What are we not allowed to do? But I do love that question. That is a good question.
Awesome. It looks like that is all we have for questions. If you have any more, feel free to reach out to Tim or myself, and we will definitely get that answer for you. Thank you all so much for joining today, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, Tim.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.